It was a perfect day to be in the woods. The sun was just beginning to set, casting warm golden light through the trees. I could feel the soft breeze on my skin, the leaves rustling gently above me. I had been walking for hours, just me and the woods, no phone calls, no noise, no expectations. I needed this. Needed to escape from everything, just for a little while. The world felt quieter here. The trees stood tall, casting long shadows on the forest floor, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. I breathed in the fresh air, the smell of pine and earth, and it was like I could finally think clearly again. Everything felt still, peaceful. No rush, no deadlines. Just me, walking alone, feeling the weight of the world melt away. I kept walking, enjoying the solitude. My boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath me was the only sound I could hear, and for a moment, it felt like the world had paused, just for me. The path was narrow but clear, winding through the trees. I felt at peace. But after a while, something started to feel off. The air felt heavier, like the weight of the trees around me was pressing in. The path had started to fade, the trees growing thicker, their branches twisting unnaturally in the dimming light. I couldn't see the trail markers anymore. The sense of calm I had felt earlier began to slip away, replaced by a creeping unease. I stopped for a moment, looking back the way I'd come. But all I saw were trees, no sign of the path. My stomach dropped. I was lost. How could I have walked this far without realizing? The trees seemed to close in on me, and the familiar sounds of the forest grew distant. My heart started to race. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but it was useless, no bars, no service. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried retracing my steps, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The trees, the shadows, the ground, they all looked the same. I couldn't tell which way was back. I was alone. And I was lost. The silence around me felt too heavy, too quiet. The wind had stopped, and all I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and fast. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who might hear me. So I kept walking, hoping to find something, anything that would lead me back to safety. That's when I heard it, a snap of a twig behind me. My heart leaped in my chest. I spun around, searching the trees, but there was no one. Nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The forest had grown too quiet again, and the trees around me seemed to loom larger, as if they were closing in. I started walking faster now, my footsteps hurried, but the path remained a mystery. The shadows had deepened, and the air had grown colder. I had no idea how long I'd been walking or in which direction. My mind raced. Was I going in circles? Was anyone else out here with me? And then, out of nowhere, a voice broke through the silence. Are you lost? I froze. My heart skipped a beat. A man, standing a few feet away in the shadows, his figure barely visible. I hadn't heard him approach. He spoke again, his voice calm and low. You look like you need help. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. I had no idea who he was or how he'd gotten there, but something about him felt off. I took a step back. I think I am lost, I managed to say, my voice shaky. The man stepped closer, his movement smooth, almost too calm. I can help you, he said, his voice steady. I know these woods. I wanted to trust him. I had no choice, really. I couldn't stay out here alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His eyes were dark, and his smile was too controlled, too knowing. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling, though I tried to keep it steady. How do you know these woods? A friend, he replied simply, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Come with me. I'll show you the way out. His words were reassuring, but I couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at me. Why was he here? What did he want? But the forest felt overwhelming now, the path still hidden beneath the thick trees and shadows. And I was tired. So tired. I took a deep breath, glancing behind me, but the trees all looked the same. The sound of my heartbeat was louder than the wind. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'll follow you." He nodded, stepping ahead, and I followed him through the woods. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching longer as the last rays of daylight disappeared behind the trees. I kept my eyes on him, my thoughts racing. What was happening? Was I safe? Or was I walking into something I didn't understand? The deeper we went into the forest, the more I felt the weight of the trees, the thick silence pressing down on me. It was like the woods were alive, watching us, waiting. And with every step, I wondered more and more, who was this man? And why had he found me in the woods? Was he here to help me? Or was he leading me somewhere I shouldn't be? As we continued deeper into the woods, the trees began to feel like walls, closing in on me from every side. The path we were on was narrow, barely visible in the growing darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going farther away from safety. I glanced at the man walking ahead of me, his figure barely visible in the dim light. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, like he knew these woods intimately, like he was one with the trees. I wanted to ask him more questions, but I couldn't find the words. There was a strange weight in the air, and despite my desperate need for reassurance, something inside me told me to be careful. The forest was silent now, too silent. It was as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something. My feet felt heavy as I followed him, the anxiety building with every step. Where was he leading me? I had no idea. The path was becoming more obscure, the trees growing thicker around us. The forest was swallowing me whole, and I wasn't sure whether he was leading me to safety or further into danger. "You said you know these woods," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound calm. "How far is it to the edge? Do you have a phone? Can we call for help?" He glanced back at me, his face unreadable in the shadows. "We're almost there," he replied softly. "Don't worry. You'll be fine." I nodded, even though his words did little to calm me. He hadn't even mentioned using a phone. There was no mention of anyone else around. My pulse quickened, my throat dry. I wanted to ask more, but something about his presence kept me from pushing any further. The deeper we went, the stranger the woods felt. The trees loomed taller now, their branches intertwining like fingers, blocking out what little light remained. It was like we had crossed some invisible boundary, entering a place that wasn't quite the same as the rest of the forest. Everything seemed darker, colder. My skin prickled with unease. I looked around, feeling the weight of the silence. The forest had changed since we entered. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves were gone. Now, the only noise was the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet and my own heartbeat, thudding loudly in my ears. I felt exposed, like the woods were watching me. Suddenly, the man stopped. I almost collided with him, my foot catching on a root in the darkness. I looked up, my heart racing as I tried to figure out what was happening. We had stopped in front of a clearing, a small, eerie space in the middle of the trees. He turned to face me, his eyes locked on mine. There was no trace of the calm, reassuring man from before. His gaze was intense, piercing. I felt my breath catch in my throat as a chill ran down my spine. "We're here," he said, his voice low. I looked around the clearing, confused. There was no sign of the path I'd been following, no sign of anything that looked like safety. The trees around us seemed to loom even closer now, pressing in as though they were trapping us in this small, dark space. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was cold, unsettling. "It's where people get lost," he said. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The words hit me like a punch. I felt my legs weaken beneath me, and I stumbled back. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, though my voice was barely a whisper. His eyes flickered with something dark, something I couldn't place. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. "I thought you were helping me," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You said you knew the way out." "I do," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the growing sound of my heartbeat. "But the way out is different for everyone." Before I could respond, a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around, trying to see where it had come from. The tree seemed to shift, their branches creaking as if they were alive. Something moved in the darkness just beyond the clearing, something big. Something watching us. My legs trembled, and I backed away, my eyes frantically searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The clearing was surrounded by thick, unyielding trees, and the man stood in front of me, blocking my only path. "You're not the first to wander into these woods," he said, his voice soft and almost tender. "But you'll be the last to leave." I tried to turn, but it was too late. The tree seemed to close in around us, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving closer. The darkness felt suffocating. I felt trapped. There was no escape. I looked at the man, this stranger who had once offered me help. The man who had seemed like my salvation. Now he was something else. His smile had faded, and his eyes were full of something far more dangerous. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man stepped back, his face unreadable. And then, as if in answer, the sound of movement grew louder. The trees around us rustled, and a low growl echoed through the clearing. Something was coming. Something big. Something that had been waiting for me all along. Before I could react, the man stepped aside, his gaze never leaving mine. The last thing I saw was the shadow moving toward me from the darkness, the thing that had been watching us all along. And then, there was nothing.